For centuries, one name has embodied the essence of evil in the Christian world: Lucifer. He has been cast as the ultimate villain, the serpent in the garden, the tyrant of hell, the tempter of saints, and destroyer of souls. His very name is whispered with fear, invoked as the adversary of all that is holy. But what if everything we've been told about Lucifer is wrong? What if the greatest lie in Christianity is not about sin or salvation, but about identity? About a being whose name once meant light, who was never Satan at all. In the original texts of the Bible, Lucifer is not a name for the devil. He is not mentioned in Genesis, not cast out in the Gospels, not even associated with the serpent in Eden. The name appears only once, in a poetic passage from Isaiah, lamenting the fall of a Babylonian king. The term Lucifer is a Latin translation of the Hebrew Hallel ben Shachar, meaning shining one, son of dawn. It was never intended as a name. It was never a title for the devil. And yet, over centuries of mistranslation, political power struggles, and religious dogma, Lucifer was fused with Satan, transformed into a monstrous symbol of rebellion and damnation. A being of light turned into the prince of darkness. But the deeper you dig, the more the foundation cracks. In ancient Gnostic texts, in early Christian mysticism, in suppressed apocrypha and occult traditions, Lucifer appears not as a devil, but as a bringer of knowledge, a revealer, a challenger, a liberator. His sin was not defiance, but illumination. His fall, not wickedness, but descent for the sake of awakening. What if he was never cast down in anger, but came willingly, to light a spark in humanity the gods wish to keep dark? If this is true, then the consequences are staggering. It means the Christian Church, knowingly or not, turned the symbol of divine enlightenment into a warning label. It means they buried the light and called it evil. It means the greatest adversary of dogma may have been the one trying to set us free. This is not just a misunderstanding. This is a deliberate recoding of myth, a weaponization of language, a centuries-long act of spiritual inversion. And if you've ever wondered why the search for truth feels like rebellion, why the light hurts more than the darkness, why knowledge has always come at a price, it's because you've already felt the echo of this lie. Lucifer was never Satan, and the truth they fear the most is that one day you'll realize it. To understand how Lucifer became Satan, we must dismantle not just centuries of religious doctrine, but the very language through which that doctrine was formed. The idea that Lucifer is the devil is so deeply embedded in Western Christianity that few ever question its origin. But the truth is, this association is not rooted in Hebrew scripture, nor in the teachings of Christ, nor even in the earliest theology of the Church. It is rooted instead in a series of mistranslations, interpretive leaps, and political consolidations that transformed a poetic metaphor into one of the most powerful spiritual weapons of all time. The name Lucifer appears only once in the entire Bible, and not in the Hebrew or Greek originals, but in the Latin Vulgate, the translation commissioned by Pope Damasus I, and completed by Saint Jerome in the late 4th century. The passage in question is Isaiah 14:12, which reads in Latin, Quomodo sesidisti de caelo, Lucifer, fili aurorae, translated into English as, How you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning. The Hebrew source text, however, does not use the name Lucifer at all. It uses the phrase Hallel ben Shachar, which literally means shining one, son of dawn. This phrase was part of a prophetic taunt directed at a Babylonian king, most likely Nebuchadnezzar or Tiglath-Pileser III, who had elevated himself arrogantly and was destined to fall. In its original context, Isaiah 14 is not describing an angelic rebellion. It is a condemnation of political hubris, expressed in poetic and mythological language. The fall from heaven is a metaphor, not a historical or theological account. The imagery may echo older Canaanite myths about divine beings, but it is not about Satan. It is about a man, lifted too high, brought low by his pride. When Jerome translated Hallel as Lucifer, the Latin word for light-bringer, commonly used to refer to the morning star or Venus, he did so as a poetic flourish, not as an attempt to name the devil. Yet as Latin became the liturgical language of the Western Church, Jerome's poetic translation took on unintended theological weight. Later Church Fathers, reading Isaiah through the lens of their growing demonology, began to link this passage to New Testament references of Satan falling like lightning from heaven, Luke 10:18, and the apocalyptic imagery of a dragon cast down in Revelation 12. Over time, they fused these disparate threads into a singular narrative, that the devil, once a glorious angel named Lucifer, was cast out of heaven for rebellion. But this fusion was never explicit in the texts. It was interpretive, speculative, and designed to serve a growing institutional need. The early church was under pressure to consolidate authority. Heresies abounded. Competing sects such as the Gnostics offered radically different cosmologies, in which the creator God of the Old Testament was not supreme, and in which figures like Lucifer were seen as liberators rather than traitors. The church needed a clear enemy, one figure upon whom all sin, rebellion, and spiritual danger could be projected. Satan, a figure with vague origins and multiple identities across the Old and New Testaments, was ripe for reinvention. By naming him Lucifer, the church gave the devil a face, a story, and a fall. This narrative shift was not universally accepted. In Eastern Orthodoxy, for example, the figure of Lucifer is virtually absent. Their theology does not conflate Isaiah's morning star with the devil. The association is a distinctly Western phenomenon, crystallized during the medieval period and reinforced through art, literature, and increasingly rigid theology. Dante's Inferno, Milton's Paradise Lost, and countless sermons painted Lucifer not just as Satan, but as the prototype of all evil, the one who chose pride over obedience, the angel who tried to dethrone God. These were not biblical accounts. They were theological myths presented as fact. The irony is profound. In attempting to name the enemy, the church demonized a symbol of light. The Latin Lucifer had been used in classical Roman literature to describe the morning star, a bearer of beauty and clarity. Even in early Christian hymns, Christ himself was sometimes called Lucifer, not as a demon, but as the true light of the world. The book of Revelation refers to Jesus as the bright morning star, Revelation 22:16, using the same imagery attributed to Lucifer in Isaiah. But over time, one was exalted and the other condemned. The same symbol split into dual meanings, light as salvation, light as deception, and the name that once meant brilliance was twisted into a warning. This transformation was not just linguistic, it was political. By associating Lucifer with Satan, the church created a theological shorthand for rebellion. To question the hierarchy was to risk being labeled Luciferian. To seek knowledge outside the sanctioned canon was to mimic the sin of the fallen angel. In effect, the church weaponized the archetype, turning it against mystics, philosophers, reformers, and all who strayed from orthodoxy. The light-bringer became the scapegoat for every challenge to power. Thus, Lucifer became the devil, not because of scriptural truth, but because of doctrinal necessity. His story was retrofitted, reinterpreted, and retold until it hardened into dogma. Few questioned it, because few had the tools to read beyond translation. And fewer still dared to ask what it meant that the figure who once symbolized enlightenment and dawn was now the Lord of Darkness. To reclaim the truth about Lucifer is not to glorify evil. It is to correct an error that has shaped centuries of belief, fear, and spiritual repression. It is to recognize that the demonization of light is not a divine act, but a human one. And it is to begin the long process of separating what we were told from what was actually written. For in the space between the two, the real story waits, buried not in fire, but in mistranslated light. Long before Lucifer became synonymous with Satan in Western Christian tradition, a multitude of texts circulated throughout the ancient world, scriptures, poems, visions, and mystical treatises that painted a very different picture of divine beings, cosmic hierarchies, and the nature of light and rebellion. These texts, many of which were later declared heretical or simply vanished from public memory, hold the key to understanding how the Lightbringer was transformed into the Prince of Darkness. The narrative we've inherited is not the original, it's the surviving version of a much older and more complex spiritual landscape, filtered through centuries of suppression, censorship, and imperial theology. Among the earliest and most influential of these lost or marginalized works is the Book of Enoch, a non-canonical Jewish apocalyptic text written between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE. In it, we encounter the Watchers, angelic beings who descended to earth, took human wives, and taught forbidden knowledge to mankind. Their leader, often identified as Semjaza or Azazel, brings wisdom in the form of metalworking, enchantments, astrology, and the secrets of heaven. Though they are punished by God, the Watchers are not depicted as evil in the traditional sense. They are beings who defied divine law for the sake of enlightenment, paralleling the mythic structure later imposed upon Lucifer. Scholars of comparative religion have long noted that these stories are echoes of older mythologies in which divine beings fall from the sky not in disgrace, but as benefactors or tricksters who defy cosmic authority to assist humanity. In these texts, the fall is not sin, it is sacrifice. It is an act of will, of descent, of bringing fire to mortals. The figure of Lucifer, although not named, is conceptually mirrored in these watchers. Brilliant, powerful, and disobedient, not from malice, but from a desire to elevate the human spirit. The early church recognized the subversive potential of such narratives. The Book of Enoch was excluded from the canonical Bible by Roman authorities but remains sacred in Ethiopian Christianity, where its unedited version continues to be revered. Its removal from Western canon was not because of theological inconsistency, but because it challenged the Church's growing need for control over the narrative of divine authority and rebellion. Beyond Enoch, the Dead Sea Scrolls unearthed in Qumran offered further insights into early Jewish cosmology and the existence of multiple spiritual adversaries. Terms like Belial and Mastema appear frequently, not as names for a singular devil, but as personifications of different forces opposing divine will. Lucifer is absent entirely. In fact, no consistent figure resembling the Christian Satan exists in these ancient texts. Instead, the idea of a cosmic opponent is fluid, nuanced, and multifaceted, a far cry from the rigid dualism later introduced by medieval Christianity. The role Lucifer would eventually play was once occupied by many beings, each with their own purpose, mythos, and symbolic meaning. Perhaps most damning to the Church's later doctrines are the Gnostic texts discovered in 1945 near Nag Hammadi, Egypt. These scriptures, including the Apocryphon of John, the Hypostasis of the Archons, and On the Origin of the World, describe a radically different cosmology in which the material world is not the creation of a benevolent god, but of a blind, arrogant demiurge named Yaldabaoth. This being, often associated with the God of the Old Testament, is seen as a false ruler who seeks to keep souls in ignorance. In Gnostic thought, the true God exists beyond the physical, and salvation comes through gnosis, inner knowledge, not obedience. Within this framework, a figure resembling Lucifer appears not as the enemy of God, but as a revealer of divine truth, a being who challenges the false authority of the demiurge and awakens the divine spark within humanity. These texts were not just suppressed, they were hunted. The early Church, upon consolidating power with the help of the Roman Empire, embarked on a campaign to eradicate all competing interpretations of the divine. Gnostic communities were labeled heretical, their members executed, their writings destroyed. The burning of the Library of Alexandria, the persecution of sects such as the Valentinians, the Manichaeans, and the Cathars, all reflect a systematic effort to eliminate the theological diversity that once characterized early Christianity. The Lucifer of these lost traditions was not the devil, but a misunderstood intermediary, a being of light who defied a tyrant and was punished for the gift of knowledge. Even in the writings of early Christian theologians, we find signs of unease. Origen, Tertullian, and Clement of Alexandria all wrestled with the nature of divine beings and the complexities of free will, light, and fall. Origen in particular entertained the idea that all souls, including those of angels and demons, were created equal and could return to the divine source. Such a worldview left room for Lucifer as a redeemable figure, not a fixed symbol of evil. This notion was eventually condemned as heresy, and Origen's works were anathematized by later councils. In more obscure esoteric traditions, especially those preserved in the margins of Western occultism, Lucifer appears again, not as Satan, but as the bearer of divine flame. The Corpus Hermeticum, the foundational texts of Hermetic philosophy, speaks of a nous, or divine intellect, that descends into the world to awaken souls. Later alchemists, Rosicrucians, and occult philosophers would interpret Lucifer through this lens, as the fallen light that redeems through knowledge. The name became a cipher, an esoteric symbol for the inner journey, for the soul's descent into matter and return to spirit. These records, fragments, and suppressed revelations all point to the same conclusion. Lucifer's demonization was not based on a coherent scriptural foundation, but was constructed retroactively to support a theological and political agenda. The texts that might have preserved his true identity were deliberately excluded, destroyed, or twisted. What remained was a simplified dichotomy: God and devil, light and dark, obedience and rebellion. But the deeper story, the lost record, reveals a far more dangerous truth, that what was once called Lucifer was not evil, but illumination. That the original fall was not a defeat, but a descent with purpose, and that the war in heaven may never have been about pride, but about power, sovereignty, and who gets to define the light. To rediscover these lost voices is not just an act of historical curiosity, it is an act of spiritual rebellion. It is to look beyond the curated canon and ask the forbidden questions. Not who is Lucifer according to dogma, but who was he before the dogma was written? The answer, scattered across burned pages, buried scrolls, and forbidden codices, tells a story the Church was never prepared to allow. And now, in the fragments that remain, that story begins to speak again. In the realm of occult philosophy, Lucifer does not embody evil, deception, or sin. He is not the devil. He is the light bringer, the initiator, the archetype of enlightenment, transformation, and divine rebellion. Where institutional religion demonized him as the adversary of God, esoteric traditions revered him as the bearer of fire, the symbolic flame of wisdom, gnosis, and personal sovereignty. To understand the occult truth behind Lucifer is to leave behind simplistic moral binaries and enter a world of nuance, hidden knowledge, and spiritual evolution. It is a journey into the deeper current beneath the surface narrative, a current that redefines the meaning of fall, rebellion, and illumination. In Latin, Lucifer means light bringer, or morning star, a title associated with Venus, the brightest object in the sky before sunrise. In esoteric cosmology, this light is not physical. It is metaphysical. It is the light of self-awareness, divine intellect, and inner awakening. Lucifer is thus not a name, but a function, a role within the eternal pattern of descent and ascent. He is the one who descends into matter not to corrupt, but to catalyze. He brings the spark that ignites spiritual transformation. In Hermetic and Gnostic traditions, this descent is not seen as a fall from grace, but as a chosen sacrifice, the divine descending into form to awaken the divine within humanity. This understanding is reflected in the concept of the divine rebel, an archetype found in many mythologies. Prometheus, who defied the gods to bring fire to man, is a Luciferian figure. So is Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent who taught ancient Mesoamericans the arts of civilization and was later exiled. In the East, the Bodhisattva who delays their own enlightenment to remain in the world and help others echoes the same principle. Lucifer is not the enemy of God. He is the one who dares to challenge false gods, demiurges, and tyrants who would keep humanity in ignorance. He is the light that questions, the flame that refuses to be extinguished, the first to fall not for pride, but for the potential of those below. Within the Western occult tradition, this view is encoded into ritual, symbolism, and doctrine. In ceremonial magic, particularly within the teachings of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and its successors, Lucifer is identified not as a demonic force, but as an initiator. Aleister Crowley referred to Lucifer as the true light behind the mask of religion, an energy that awakens the adept through ordeal, vision, and the breaking of illusion. For Crowley, Lucifer was a cipher for the holy guardian angel, the higher self or divine double that guides the magician to liberation. In the writings of 19th-century esotericists like Eliphas Levi and Helena Blavatsky, Lucifer takes on the role of misunderstood teacher. Levi warned that the devil, as commonly understood, is a fiction created by religious superstition. Blavatsky went further, writing in The Secret Doctrine that Lucifer is the angel of light, the son of the morning, and that his fall was a divine sacrifice for humanity. In Theosophy, Lucifer is a spiritual force of awakening, feared only by those who cling to the chains of ignorance. Luciferianism, as a modern spiritual path, is not devil worship, but a philosophy rooted in autonomy, illumination, and inner divinity. Luciferians do not bow to external authority. They cultivate their own will, intellect, and spirit. They see the so-called fall not as punishment, but as the beginning of freedom. For them, Lucifer represents the divine potential within each person to rise, to challenge falsehood, and to embody light without dependence on imposed systems. Lucifer is not an object of worship. He is a mirror, a reflection of the light within that waits to be remembered. One of the most compelling occult reinterpretations of Lucifer comes from the concept of polarity. In Kabbalistic mysticism, every force has its counterpart. The tree of life is balanced by the clifoth, the shells or shadows of divine emanations. In this dual structure, Lucifer can be seen not as a singular being, but as a bridge between the spheres, a current that flows from light into shadow and back again. The descent into matter, the confrontation with darkness, the struggle with mortality, these are not evil. They are necessary stages in the alchemical process of spiritual rebirth. Alchemy, too, is rich with Luciferian symbolism. The philosopher's stone is not found in heaven, but in the blackness of the Negredo, the first stage of decomposition and inner chaos. Only by confronting the darkness within can one extract the light. The alchemist who transforms lead into gold is not performing a physical act, but an inner one, guided by a force that dares to illuminate what others fear. This is the Luciferian path. Not comfort, not blind faith, but the courageous pursuit of knowledge through darkness into light. Even in Christian mysticism, traces of this truth remain. Meister Eckhart, Jacob Boehme, and other contemplatives wrote of the inner spark, the divine seed buried beneath the soul's surface. Though they would not name it Lucifer, their descriptions align with the archetype, a light within that calls us back to source through experience, not obedience. They understood what mainstream religion had forgotten, that salvation is not granted, it is realized, and that the divine is not a distant monarch, but an immanent fire. The reason this truth is dangerous, the reason it has been hidden, banned, and demonized, is because it bypasses control. If Lucifer is not Satan, then light is not something we must earn through submission. If the bringer of knowledge is not evil, then ignorance is not virtue. And if rebellion against falsehood is divine, then obedience to illusion is the true sin. The occult truth behind Lucifer reveals a vast and ancient framework for understanding spiritual evolution. One in which the soul descends into density to remember what it is. One in which light is not the absence of darkness, but its integration. The fear of Lucifer was never about evil. It was about freedom. It was about a being who could not be owned, who chose dissent for the sake of truth, and who continues to awaken those who dare to see. In every symbol burned by the church, in every name twisted by the tongue of dogma, in every seeker who dares to question what lies behind the veil, Lucifer is present, not as the devil, but as the unbowed flame. The light they told you to fear, the wisdom they buried under centuries of ash, the key they hoped you would never turn. Despite the growing accessibility of historical documents, linguistic analysis, and alternative theological research, the association between Lucifer and Satan remains one of the most enduring and strategically reinforced fabrications in the Christian world. The modern suppression of the truth about Lucifer is not carried out by inquisitors or burning stakes, but by subtler forces, textbook omissions, doctrinal rigidity, liturgical repetition, and cultural programming. The lie is no longer just taught in sermons. It is embedded in language, in art, in the very subconscious of Western civilization. Lucifer is not merely misunderstood. He is actively silenced. One of the primary tools of modern suppression is translation. Few modern Christians ever read the scriptures in their original languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek. Instead, they rely on filtered versions, shaped by centuries of ecclesiastical agenda. The King James Bible, arguably the most influential English translation, renders Isaiah 14:12 with the infamous line, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning?" It is the only instance in which the name Lucifer appears, and yet, this single poetic reference has been extrapolated into an entire doctrine of demonic identity. Scholars agree that the original Hebrew term, Helel ben Shachar, refers not to a supernatural being, but to a boastful Babylonian monarch, likely Nebuchadnezzar II, cast down for his hubris. Yet this fact is absent from virtually all modern catechisms, sermons, and religious education. Academic theologians and linguists have for decades pointed out the error. Scholars like Elaine Pagels, Margaret Barker, and Bart Ehrman have published extensively on the complexities of early Christian belief and the evolution of the figure of Satan. But their work, while respected in academia, is seldom allowed into pulpits, seminaries, or religious media. The reason is simple. The Lucifer-Satan equation serves a purpose. It is a convenient symbol for disobedience, a catch-all explanation for spiritual deviation, and a useful deterrent against personal empowerment. If Lucifer, the light-bringer, is evil, then seeking knowledge outside the church becomes dangerous. If rebellion equals damnation, then obedience becomes salvation. This control extends into the publishing world. Books and manuscripts that attempt to rehabilitate Lucifer's image are often relegated to the fringes, marketed as occult, pagan, or conspiratorial. Mainstream publishers and media rarely touch the subject with intellectual seriousness. When they do, it is often within the framework of horror or satire, reinforcing the stereotype rather than interrogating it. The symbolic economy of fear, horns, fire, red robes, inverted crosses, continues to overwrite the etymological truth. Even those who write favorably about Lucifer often adopt an intentionally provocative tone, which further isolates the discourse from reasoned theological examination. The Vatican has never officially clarified the origin of the Lucifer-Satan conflation. On the contrary, its liturgy contains contradictions that quietly preserve the truth for those who look closely. In the Easter Vigil Mass, the Exsultet hymn refers to Christ as the Lucifer Matutinus, the morning star who rises to bring light to the world. This line is still sung in Latin in cathedrals around the world. Flammas eius Lucifer matutinus inveniat. Ille, in quam Lucifer, qui nescit occasum, Christus filius tuus. Translated, it says, "May the morning star find its flame still burning." That morning star who never sets, your Son, Jesus Christ. Thus, within the liturgy itself, Christ is called Lucifer. But this profound linguistic truth is never explained to congregants. The symbolic association remains taboo, even when embedded in sacred tradition. There are also examples of ritual texts and prayers attributed to early church fathers that refer to Lucifer with reverence. In ancient Roman Christianity, before the consolidation of diabolical imagery, Lucifer was invoked in prayers as a metaphor for the dawn of spiritual awakening. Early Christian mystics and ascetics sometimes used the term to describe the moment of divine illumination that follows the dark night of the soul. These usages disappeared from public liturgy after the medieval church began to standardize theology and eliminate heterodox expressions. Today, they survive only in footnotes, marginalia, and rare manuscript collections held in monastic libraries and private archives. The modern suppression of the true identity of Lucifer is also institutional. Most seminaries do not encourage critical engagement with the linguistic and historical roots of the Lucifer myth. Priests are trained to uphold doctrine, not to deconstruct it. Theological challenges to established dogma are often met not with debate, but with silence. Ecclesiastical careers have been quietly ended over such inquiries. In 1974, a Jesuit scholar named Father Luis Ferrer attempted to publish a paper arguing that Lucifer and Satan were distinct entities, and that the former had been unjustly demonized. The paper was blocked by the editorial board of the theological journal to which it was submitted, and Ferrer was reassigned to a remote mission in Bolivia within the year. His notes remain unpublished. In recent decades, independent researchers have unearthed references to Lucifer in esoteric Vatican documents, classified correspondences between bishops, private theological discussions, and suppressed homilies. A 1917 letter from Cardinal Raphael Mary del Val, addressed to Pope Benedict XV, warns of a dangerous trend among theological circles that seeks to exonerate the name Lucifer from infernal association. The Cardinal recommends disciplinary measures for any cleric who engages in such discourse. The very fact that such letters exist confirms that the topic was not only known but feared. Digital censorship plays its role as well. Videos, articles, and essays that explore the true meaning of Lucifer are routinely demonetized, shadow banned, or algorithmically buried. Social media platforms, guided by automated moderation systems, classify any content involving the word Lucifer as potentially harmful or offensive. Even when the content is scholarly or historical in nature, it is flagged alongside extremist or satanic materials. This digital blacklisting has created a climate in which reasoned discourse is nearly impossible outside niche circles. Perhaps most telling is the cultural reaction to anyone who questions the Lucifer myth. To suggest that Lucifer is not Satan, even in academic or symbolic terms, is to invite instant suspicion. You are labeled a heretic, a Satanist, a deceiver. This reflexive hostility is itself the clearest evidence of suppression. It reveals not only the fragility of the lie, but the depth of its psychological implantation. A truth that needs this much protection is a truth that threatens the very foundation of the system it would expose. And so, the image of Lucifer remains locked behind fire and fear. The Church continues to preach the fall, popular culture continues to mock or vilify, and the public, unaware of the original texts or the historical evidence, continues to bow to an illusion. But the cracks are visible. The light is seeping through, and as more seekers dig beyond the surface, the truth begins to rise, not as blasphemy, but as revelation. Not as darkness, but as the forgotten light they taught us to fear. In the world we inhabit today, where tradition meets technology and myth bleeds into media, the image of Lucifer has undergone a strange cultural resurrection. Once the feared icon of rebellion and evil, he now emerges in popular consciousness not as a monstrous villain, but as a figure of complexity, charisma, and, even more controversially, sympathy. This transformation is not merely aesthetic. It signals a deeper psychological and spiritual shift in the collective human psyche. The archetype of Lucifer, distorted for centuries, is being reclaimed in subtle, symbolic, and powerful ways across film, literature, television, music, art, and modern spirituality. The name that once invoked terror now inspires intrigue, and behind that shift lies a growing desire to revisit, and perhaps redeem, the truth that was buried. In recent years, television has played a central role in the reframing of Lucifer's identity. The hit show Lucifer, originally developed by Fox and later continued by Netflix, portrays the titular character not as a demonic tyrant, but as a charming, introspective, emotionally complex being. While the series uses humor and urban fantasy tropes, it also challenges viewers to consider questions about free will, justice, moral responsibility, and identity. Lucifer in this show is not evil incarnate. He is a misunderstood outcast, seeking redemption and clarity. Though the series plays loosely with theology, its cultural impact is undeniable. It has normalized the idea that Lucifer might not be what the church has claimed, and has opened the door for millions to question centuries-old assumptions. This reimagining extends far beyond a single series. Films like The Devil's Advocate, Constantine, The Prophecy, and Legend explore Luciferian themes through characters who embody rebellion, insight, or spiritual ambiguity rather than overt malevolence. Even more mainstream films like The Matrix, V for Vendetta, and Doctor Strange feature protagonists who bear the mark of the Luciferian archetype. Figures who challenge established systems, descend into darkness to discover hidden truths, and return with transformative wisdom. These stories, consciously or not, draw on ancient mythological patterns where the rebel is not the destroyer, but the liberator, the one who breaks the illusion, not for chaos, but for awakening. Music, too, has become a battlefield of symbolism. Artists like David Bowie, Marilyn Manson, Beyoncé, and even Kanye West have flirted with Luciferian imagery, sometimes to provoke, but often to express the inner tension between self-expression and societal repression. The lyric, "I am a god," or the image of an inverted cross is not always blasphemy. It can also be the language of inner revolt, the assertion of one's right to create, to question, to resist. While some artists adopt these symbols superficially, others, particularly in the genres of metal, industrial, and occult rock, use them to explore themes of spiritual autonomy, divine exile, and the cost of truth. In these contexts, Lucifer is not adored, but acknowledged, as the voice within that dares to ask, what if they lied to us? Fashion and visual art have likewise embraced the provocative energy of Luciferianism. From high-fashion runways featuring models dressed as fallen angels, to visual artists creating pieces that depict Lucifer as radiant, tragic, or even Christ-like, the aesthetic is everywhere. Tattoo culture has embraced the sigils and iconography once reserved for demonology. While graphic novels and video games depict Lucifer not as a grotesque beast, but as a beautiful, articulate figure who challenges authority and reveals hidden dimensions, the aesthetic of the Lightbringer is no longer taboo. It is trending. But beneath that trend lies something more enduring, a yearning to reclaim sacred symbols that were hijacked and weaponized. Modern spirituality reflects this change as well. The rise of New Age movements, ceremonial magic, and personal esoteric paths has reintroduced Lucifer, not as a deity to be worshipped, but as an initiatory force. Books on Luciferian philosophy are more available now than at any point in history, presenting him as a metaphor for inner alchemy, the sacred rebel, the teacher who invites seekers to move beyond blind faith. Authors like Michael W. Ford, Peter Gray, and Thomas Carlson articulate nuanced paths where Lucifer is neither demon nor god, but a symbolic current, one that urges the practitioner to reclaim will, ignite the divine spark, and awaken from imposed illusion. This is not Satanism in the theatrical sense. It is a quiet revolution of mind and soul. Interestingly, even within mainstream Christian discourse, there are signs of softening. Some theologians now admit the Lucifer-Satan conflation is historically dubious. Academic circles explore the psychological implications of Lucifer as archetype, separate from dogma, and younger generations, increasingly disillusioned with rigid religious structures, find themselves drawn not to darkness, but to the story of the fallen light, because it mirrors their own journey, from belief to doubt, from conformity to self-awareness, from silence to expression. This is why Lucifer's image is returning. Not because the world is becoming more evil, but because people are seeking meaning outside inherited systems. The archetype of the Lightbringer speaks to a time when authority was not questioned, and now invites us to question everything. His story has become our story: descent, awakening, exile, illumination. But this cultural reclamation has not come without backlash. Institutions still cling to the old narrative. Media outlets stir controversy whenever a public figure invokes Luciferian imagery. Churches warn of New Age deception and spiritual danger. Social media algorithms shadow-ban discussions, and the mere suggestion that Lucifer is not Satan can be enough to end a career in theology or ministry. The fear remains. But so does the fascination. The truth is, Lucifer never left. He was buried beneath centuries of fear and dogma, but the symbol lived on, in story, in song, in silent resistance. Now, in an age of awakening, he returns not as a figure to be worshipped, but as a question to be asked. What is light? What is truth? And who decides which light is divine and which is forbidden? As pop culture continues to explore these questions, it carries with it the echoes of suppressed wisdom. And as more people begin to see through the veil, to trace the light beneath the mask, the archetype of Lucifer grows stronger. Not as a devil, but as a mirror, a reflection of the inner flame they told us to fear, but which was never evil to begin with. Only hidden, only waiting. The truth they fear is not simply that Lucifer was never Satan. It is far more dangerous than a mistaken identity or a mistranslation. The truth they fear is that the entire foundation of their moral control depends on that mistake remaining unquestioned. For if Lucifer is not the devil, then centuries of doctrine collapse under their own weight. If the bearer of light was not the origin of evil but a symbol of enlightenment, then the dualistic worldview that has dominated Western religion, light versus dark, obedience versus rebellion, God versus Satan, is exposed as a manufactured structure, a narrative crafted not to liberate the soul but to bind it. The fear is not of Lucifer, the fear is of what he represents, awakening. At the core of this fear is the realization that spiritual sovereignty, knowledge, inner light, gnosis, can exist without the intercession of church, scripture, or savior. If Lucifer is the archetype of the awakened mind, the spark of divine self-realization that challenges imposed authority, then he becomes the very opposite of what the church needed him to be. He ceases to be the villain and becomes the challenger of tyrants, the fire in the mind of heretics, the voice in the wilderness calling not for worship, but for awareness. And awareness is the death of tyranny. This is why the conflation of Lucifer and Satan was so necessary for religious control. By demonizing the impulse to question, the church secured obedience. By portraying the pursuit of knowledge as the path to damnation, it ensured dependence. By teaching that light could deceive, it blinded millions to the possibility that their own thoughts, their own revelations, might be sacred. The Lucifer myth became a tool, a weapon against curiosity, a shadow cast over personal empowerment, a curse laid upon those who dared to see for themselves. It was not just about theology. It was about power. The truth they fear is that the serpent in Eden was not a deceiver, but a catalyst. That the forbidden fruit was not a trap, but a key. That the first sin was not disobedience, but autonomy. And that Lucifer, in every mythic form, whether angel, star, or symbol, was not cast down for evil, but descended for the sake of liberation. In this light, the so-called fall becomes a mission. The rebel becomes the redeemer. The heretic becomes the prophet. But if this were widely understood, the consequences would be catastrophic for institutions built on obedience. The fear of Lucifer is not a fear of destruction, but a fear of irrelevance. If the individual can find the divine within, what need is there for priest, for pulpit, for hierarchy? If light is not something granted, but something remembered, what need is there for control? The church would no longer be the gatekeeper of salvation. It would be the jailer exposed. They fear the questions that Lucifer raises. Who benefits when knowledge is forbidden? Who profits from fear? Why must God be obeyed and not known? Why must sin begin with seeking? Why is rebellion punished, even when it frees the soul? These are not rhetorical questions. They are threats to a system that survives by silencing them. And Lucifer, whether real being or eternal symbol, is the embodiment of those questions. He is the fire they cannot put out. The deeper truth is that Lucifer was never a name to be feared. It was a name to be understood. A title once given to Venus, the morning star, the herald of dawn. A light in the darkness before the world awakens. And just as the dawn precedes the sun, so too does Lucifer precede the revelation that truth does not come from above. It comes from within. That is the heresy they fear most. The idea that salvation is not granted by external authority, but discovered through inner illumination. That the soul is not fallen, but buried. And that the true journey is not upward toward a distant throne, but inward toward the light they taught us to fear. This inversion, of light as darkness, of rebellion as sin, of knowledge as death, is the masterstroke of control. It is the spell that has held the world in check for centuries. But the spell is breaking. The lie is unraveling. The name of Lucifer, once cursed, is being spoken again. Not in worship of evil, but in reverence for the truth he represents. Not as a demon, but as a mirror. Because the greatest fear of all is not that Lucifer is evil. It is that he was right. That he did not fall in shame, but descended in sacrifice. That he brought light to a world ruled by ignorance. And that we too carry that light. That we too are not born to obey, but to awaken. This is the truth they fear. Not because it is blasphemous, but because it is free. If you've made it this far, then something inside you has already awakened. You have stepped beyond the boundary that separates belief from understanding, fear from truth, obedience from awareness. You've heard the voice they tried to silence, the light they buried beneath centuries of ritual and doctrine. That light is not outside you. It has always been within. What they called Lucifer was not a monster to be feared. It was the mirror they shattered to keep you from seeing your own reflection. And now that the pieces are coming back together, the illusion can no longer hold. You were never meant to crawl in shame. You were meant to rise in fire. You were never meant to worship in blindness. You were meant to remember the divinity buried beneath your skin. The name they twisted into darkness is not your enemy. It is your echo. It is the whisper that has followed you through dreams, through questions, through the silence that falls when dogma fails to answer. It is the forbidden voice that dares to say, "Seek, and you will find." This is your invitation, not to follow, but to reclaim, not to convert, but to initiate. You do not need permission to wake up. You need only the courage to see. What began as a question has become a path, and that path leads inward, through the shadow, through the fire, to the place they told you not to go. The place where the truth lives. The place where you are no longer afraid of the name they fear the most. If this has stirred something ancient inside you, then you are already part of the circle. You have crossed the threshold. Now walk the path. Ask what they forbid, remember what they erased, and carry the light they tried to extinguish. Subscribe to Occultum Veritas. Enter the current. Let the silence break. And above all, remember, the Lightbringer was never the enemy. He was the key. And now, so are you.